Well, I worked for the Globe and Mail for 8.5 years, and it's funny what sticks in your mind. Certain incidents, they could be internal or external. And one that really comes to my mind, and fortunately, I did write an account of this in my journal for March 19th, 1968 to August the 17th, 1968. And to just briefly set the scene, I was working nights, or I was working days actually, and I was handed 3 general assignments, they called them. They could be about anything. I was, later on the education beat, the religion beat, Queen's Park beat. And so on Tuesday, June the 25th, 1968, reading from my journal, I wrote a story about the then Attorney General, Wishart, who had made a statement in the Ontario House, and another story about a teacher referendum. And then there was what I've written down as the Eaton jewel theft yarn. Now, for some reason, I was asked to follow up a police report that burglars had broken into the second floor of the Eaton family mansion in Forest Hill and made off with a bunch of jewels. And so I was assigned to flesh out this story. So I'm going to read from this journal, which is better than me just trying to recollect it. Worst of the day was the Eaton thing. I couldn't think of having to deal with a much worse combination of sources than the cops and the Eatons. Especially about 10 p.m., see, I had finished work much earlier, when Nancy Lewis, who was on the desk at the time of the Globe and Mail, called me at home in a panic that my story was contradictory regarding the time of the theft. The conversation went something like this when I phoned one of the Eatons that I was given the phone number of. Hello, a rather gruff voice, too much smoking, dissolute. This is Barrie Zwicker speaking. I'm sorry to trouble you at home and at this time. Excuse me. But in the story that we did on the jewelry theft, we have a contradiction about something quite simple, namely which night it occurred, Friday or Saturday night. Answer: look, I'm not interested in answering your little questions, all right? Well, sir, as I said, I'm sorry to trouble you, but just one little point. Can you just answer that? Look, call the police, okay? Pained, spoiled brat tone of voice. I did call the police. And what did they say? They didn't know. Well, you're supposed to be a reporter, so you find out yourself. That's what I'm trying to do. Just read the afternoon papers. Me, they're confused on the point. That's why I'm calling you. Look, I'm a little bored with all this. Well, all I'm trying to do is find out. What do the afternoon papers say? They say that the theft took place during a Queen's Plate reception on Friday night, but the Queen's Plate was run on Saturday. There was no Queen's Plate party here at all. Well, you told me to read the afternoon papers. If I did, I'd be wrong on this, wouldn't I? When was the theft? It was Friday night. All right, thank you. And when I said I was sorry to trouble you, I really meant it, okay? Hang up at the other end. I've written in my journal, what pricks the Eatons are. I hope they never get their jewels back. So that's one anecdote from my days on the Globe and Mail.
Oh, the life of a reporter, eh?
Yeah. Actually, there's another story I could tack on here, because when I was at the Globe and Mail, I won a Southam Fellowship. That's for newspaper people or media people. And so that was back in the same era. And so I could attend any classes I wanted. You had and you got paid your regular pay for that whole year and a bit. So I spotted Marshall McLuhan's course, and I thought, boy, that's what I want to go. I knew enough about him that I was really intrigued. He hadn't begun to have the worldwide reputation he had, but it was known that he was on the leading edge of something. And so I attended his course that year in the old coach house on the southeast corner of the U of T campus, next to that big cathedral. And then I continued to take the course for the next 3 years. I audited it. So I got to know McLuhan a bit. And one day, I don't know why, but he invited me to join him for lunch. And at that time, there was a restaurant called La Scala on the east side of Avenue Road, or University, just on the edge of the U of T campus. So I went to McLuhan's office. We walked through the campus. On the way, there was a groundsman with a power mower going like that, and McLuhan covered his ears and he screamed, "I can't stand it." It was very sensitive sensorium. Anyway, we continued on to La Scala, and the lunch was with a guy from New York, a big vice president of IBM Corporation. And this guy was the very picture of a corporate character. He had on a really expensive suit. His jaw was square. His hair was black and curly. And at some point in the conversation, the subject of progress came up. And so McLuhan was not big on the idea of progress. You know, it might have been McLuhan, or I would say it might as well have been McLuhan, who said, you can learn everything you know by reading Chaucer, right? He was a real literary historian and steeped in the English language, and he didn't have much time for the idea of progress. So this IBM guy picked up on that, and he said, listen, I really believe in progress. He said, quote, if I can fly to Mars for lunch, I want to fly to Mars for lunch. And he banged his fist on the table to emphasize that. So Marshall McLuhan had this look on his face like, oh boy, you know, I have really met somebody here that I can't go along with. And that's all I remember of that lunch. But it was classic. And it sort of grew out of my days at the Globe and Mail when I first met Marshall McLuhan in person. And my days at University of Toronto and on a Southam Fellowship. Mm-hmm. So they kind of came together.
Wow. So how would you say McLuhan influenced your thinking moving forward as a journalist or as someone involved in media?
Oh, he absolutely influenced me. The first time I encountered him, I was assigned to cover a meeting of what was called, it was a provincial committee on the aims and objectives of education in Ontario, which became known as the Hall-Dennis Report. And so the session that I went to was something like the 72nd session of this committee, which had been touring the province, was held in the old Four Seasons Hotel, which was about a 2 or 3 story structure on Jarvis Street across from the CBC, the Kremlin, what they called it, above Carlton there. And so Marshall McLuhan, I think, was the first witness. And former Chief Justice Emmett Hall of the Supreme Court of Canada was the chairman. He eventually became the co-chairman because he really wasn't up to the job as much as he should have been. And he asked Marshall McLuhan, well, what have you got to say for us, Mr. McLuhan, or Professor McLuhan? And McLuhan said something like, education is all rear view mirror stuff. It's teaching students things that they don't need to know. It just destroys initiative and curiosity. That's how he started off, right? And then his whole testimony was along that line. And he came out with these aphorisms that later everybody knew, like, we don't know who discovered water, but we know it wasn't a fish. See, because he knew about the anti-environment. And the medium is the message,
Yeah,
of course, which is known worldwide. And there are many, and I was just scribbling this down saying, wow, in my head, wow, wow. And I thought, this is front page stuff. And I was right. My story went on the front page. So that is how I met Marshall McLuhan to begin with. And to me, I'm still studying McLuhan. I've got probably 7 or 8 books of his, or by him or about him. And his insights, he called them probes. He didn't use the word insight, because he was always asking questions. And sometimes his probes were ridiculous. Like he would say, and he said it actually at this hearing, he said, classrooms are going to become obsolete. If you want a date, I'd say 5 years from now. Well, you know, that was 60 years ago, and we still have classrooms. But that was the nature of him, that he would just throw these things out, these probes, and they made you think. And I've been inspired by Marshall McLuhan ever since. And I think he was an authentic genius, and he could be erratic. And of course, what happened was that he was seconded to Fordham University in New York to be a visiting professor there. And while he was there, he suffered a really bad stroke. And they found that there was a tumor like the size of a baseball or whatever. And there was this 18-hour operation. And he was never quite the same after. It left him more irritable. And so there were people who would say, well, Marshall McLuhan was rude. As a matter of fact, they lived, the McLuhans, on Wells Hill Avenue, which is about 2 blocks south of here. And then they moved over to Witchwood Park, which is about 5 blocks from here. And there were people who would meet Marshall McLuhan, and one of them said to me, boy, is that guy rude. Because he'd recognized McLuhan and he asked him some question. And McLuhan just didn't have time for necessarily anybody asking him a question, especially if he thought it was a dumb question. But his rudeness arose from his whole personality. He had to cut him slack, and the fact that he had this stroke. A lot of people become irritable after they have a stroke. My father had a series of strokes, and it happened to him. And so Marshall McLuhan is a tremendous ornament, in the best sense of the word, for Canada and for Canadian intellectualism and, of course, media history. There was recently a play put on by the Tarragon Theatre, which again is about 5 blocks from here, called The Message. And it's written by Jason Sherman, one of our leading playwrights. And there's a monologue toward the end where R.H. Thompson, who plays McLuhan in this play, says these amazing things that apply right today. And I thought, gosh, Jason Sherman has really captured the essence of McLuhan, and then he wrote that into the character played by R.H. Thompson. So I contacted Jason Sherman, the playwright, and I said, I'd like to quote from parts of your play in my memoirs. I have a whole chapter on McLuhan. And I said, that last part, you really nailed it. He said, that wasn't me. That was word for word what McLuhan said in a conference in 1966. And it just predicts the future as we're experiencing it today.
Yeah.
He talked about the internet before it had a name. He actually said there will be a place eventually where we'll be able to go, and in seconds we'll be able to bring up all knowledge. And he said that in the 60s. And so you just got to hand it to him.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's amazing.